Hi, I'm Marci Revelli, and today we're going to talk about AAC assessment strategies for direct selectors. Those are the kids who use their hands, probing AAC in the context of speech-language evaluations and therapy. So this topic came about because I have been asked by therapists, I just want some tools in my toolkit when a kid comes in for evaluation or for short-term treatment in order to probe AAC to find out if it's going to be useful for them. So that's why we have this talk today. For learning objectives, we're going to list some commonalities and differences between speech and language evaluations and AAC evaluations. We'll talk about the continuum of communication and competence. I want you to understand that we have an AAC toolkit and the materials in that toolkit. So we're going to talk about the stuff that comes with AAC and then how to use those tools as indicators for speech and language support. By way of background, this is a no-brainer. We know that assessing kids for AAC systems can feel overwhelming if you don't perform these assessments very often. It used to be that we would think about AAC when there was little to no spoken language, so as an alternative. But now we really know that AAC can help support the individual's current speech and language development, so it augments. So we have this whole bigger category of kids that we're thinking, will AAC be useful? The first thing I always go to is the underlying medical diagnoses. We all see a range of disorders, and the variety of disorders necessitates that we have knowledge of their characteristics, their progressions. We know that there are underlying etiologies can be developmental or acquired. It can be motor, cognitive linguistic, or social interactive. And now with genetic testing, it feels almost like a challenge to keep up with all the different diagnoses and what happens with communication. So one of the things that I often do when I'm confronted with a rare diagnosis or one I've never heard of before is I'll ask the family who more than likely has gone on to social media and the websites, and I'll say, you know, can you tell me what you know about the communication progression? And this gives me an indication not only of what the progression is for communication development, but also what the parents know if they've done their own research. So here's a slide that shows speech and language evaluations versus AAC evaluations. And the point I want to make here is that we do things very, very similarly. We all prep for our evaluation. We take a case history, we interview the parent, we observe the child, we do formal testing, we may do some informal testing or dynamic assessment. And we're getting close to finalizing. We may do that stimulability testing in order to then formulate some priorities for goals. We write our summary and recommendations and do our parent education. Well, with AAC, we're gathering those testing materials, we're gathering our toys, and yes, we have some stuff. We have the AAC material, so we're going to talk about that. We all ask, you know, what is your child's current communication ability and what is your current concern? We all do speech and language communication assessments. I will sometimes do a Goldman-Fristow, sometimes do a PLS in order to get more information about their speech or language. There are specific AAC assessments that we won't go into in detail today, but know that they're there for your reference. I do a lot of informal and dynamic assessment, looking at receptive language. I very frequently take a speech and language sample, look at play. And then this is where we start to look at the child's capabilities. So everything thus far has really been focused on speech, language, and communication. In the context of understanding that about the child, which is what we all do, now I'm going to start to pay closer attention to what are the child's capabilities with their motor. What are they doing with their body, with their hands? What are they doing with their hearing or with their vision? Or are there other factors cognitively, developmentally, linguistically that I start to pay attention to? So I'm gathering a whole child approach to what they're bringing to the table. And then finally, we have this term AAC feature matching. And I think if you think back to your graduate education, the term feature matching sometimes instills a lot of fear because you think that you have to know all the features that are available for AAC in order to make good recommendations. So I want to give you an analogy. I'm in the market to buy a car, and I have 4 features that I want in my car. I want all-wheel drive. I want higher clearance because I like to go off-roading. I want a hatchback so I can put lots of stuff in there. And I want heated seats because I'm always cold. So I narrow it down. I kind of think, and price. So I'm thinking Subaru, Honda, Mazda. Okay, I've got my 3 choices. And I go with Subaru. And I buy the Subaru and I get in the Subaru and I've got my 4 main features. But holy cow, there's like all these other really cool features. There's a sunroof, and there's power steering, and so forth and so on. So the message I want you to think about is not to be scared of what you don't know. What you do with feature matching is you take the primary needs of the child and match them to a few features that are going to really launch that child and support that child. And you can always reassess. Don't worry about the myriad of other features of other AAC systems. So that's how we're alike and how we're different. One other thing I want to provide to you as far as an overview is something called the Continuum of Early Communication. And this is a mesh of 2 different ideas. The first idea is early childhood assessment. So you're really looking at the youngest communicators in the realm of birth to 3. And then also a continuum of communication competence is a term that shows up in the AAC world, where we're looking at how competent a child is in their ability to communicate using AAC materials. So I've bridged all of that, and what you can see is for every child, we're going to put them into the realm of either being a pre-symbolic communicator or a symbolic communicator. So the definition of that is, if you are a symbolic communicator, you are using a spoken word, a sign, or a picture to help you build communication. So those are the symbols, the things that stand for other things. If you are pre-symbolic, you're not doing that. So you're not using a spoken word, a sign, or a picture. And then we have 2 different categories. We have your pre-intentional communicators and then your intentional communicators. The pre-intentional communicators are really those youngest chronologically or developmentally, where they're just using their behavior. The intentional communicators who are pre-symbolic are communicating. They're using other means besides symbols. So you'll recognize this. The goals that we typically offer these kids are things like vocal reciprocity, shaping conventional gestures such as waving or pointing or a head nod or shake. We're focused on the basic elements of communication, such as turn taking and coordinating attention, giving, reaching, pointing, distal and proximal, so near and far, and then imitation. Studies have found that these kids are less likely to benefit from interventions that target primarily linguistic or symbolic modalities. In other words, if we push too hard to get that more sign or to get the child to say more without having a more solid foundation of intentional communication, it's going to be harder to progress. So what we recommend is that you can target the frequency, range, and clarity of all of these pre-symbolic communication behaviors, while you can model or show the child, hey, this is what more looks like, or this is how I point to pictures. Moving into the symbolic realm, we have 3 different levels. The emergent communicators, those are the kids who have no reliable method of expressive communication using symbols. So they maybe have a spoken word approximation, maybe they use a sign or two, but they don't do it consistently, reliably. We also, moving into the realm of context-dependent communicators, these are the kids that have symbolic communication, and it is reliable, but it's limited to the specific context or partners. And then finally, we have the independent communicators, and those are the kids who can say anything about any topic, anywhere. Oops, excuse me. Let's see. There it is. So really, for the rest of this talk, we're focused on this section of communicators. A little bit of that modeling with the intentional pre-symbolic communicators, but then really, how are we building symbolic communication with the emergent or context-dependent communicators? Okay, so that's enough of the lingo. So the first question you ask yourself is, well, why not just work on speech? And we know from the research that sign language and picture symbols can support a bigger expressive vocabulary. We know sign language and picture symbols can reduce frustration, and it also can increase spoken language. So then the next question you ask yourself is, well, will traditional speech and language instruction be enough? And that's the $100,000 question, right? Factors to consider include, what is their diagnosis? What is their prognosis for improvement? How have they been acquiring their speech sounds? What's the frequency? What's the speed of acquisition for the speech sounds, but also for spoken word acquisition? How are they taking those words and combining them? And then finally, I always think and ask families to reflect, what has the progress been like in the past 3 months? So then you're thinking AAC might be a good idea, and we all think about sign language because, hey, it's free, and here's my hands, and I have hands, and I know some signs, so it might be a good idea. Well, it's a good idea for kids who have a diagnosis of a hearing impairment. It's a good idea if the family is committed to learning and using sign as a fluent language system. So families have their hearts in the right place when they say, oh, we watch Signing Times videos, which is giving the child vocabulary, but not giving the child a fluent model of a language system. And then we also know from research that sign language can be a really great stepping stone to improve spoken language development. So some factors to think about when you're thinking about sign language are, what is that child's motor ability? For example, if they have an apraxia, would they have a subtle, gross, or fine motor or a limb apraxia, which might make learning sign language difficult? I often ask about the teacher and the family's ability to model and teach sign language. And I also educate families about school placement decisions, so that they understand that if they choose sign language to support their child when they get to preschool, if the child doesn't have a hearing impairment, the school is not obligated to provide sign language instruction and interpretation. I've had several families come in with older kids who are beautiful signers, 300, 600 signs, and without the diagnosis of a hearing impairment, the school will not support them. So let's get into the AAC materials, the stuff. I'm going to talk about my go-to toys and activities. I'll show you some images of Velcro picture symbols, picture boards and books, tablets, jelly beans or buddy button switches, voice output communicators, and static display systems. And I'm not going to go into any depth for the last three, except to say that those are in the toolkit and they can be used for kids who are at the lower end of the communication continuum. So let's dive into the stuff. When I'm doing an AAC assessment, the first thing I'm looking for is motivation. So I will hold up a ball or a car and I'll say which one you want. And I'm looking to optimize the child's attention. And then when I have their attention with a particular toy, I'm probing for AAC use, so sign language or picture symbols. A good starting point, but harder to shift attention with AAC, and I'll explain that in a minute, are the bubbles, balls, cars, tops, blocks, cause and effect toys. So those are my go-to toys in my toolkit. I hold up the ball, I hold up the car, and the child chooses the car. And I can see by holding these two things up that the child can move their attention between the two, and then they can look back at me, and they can look to the car, and they can look to me. So now I've got their attention. They're looking at the car, they're looking at me. I'm going to bring out my AAC materials. For some kids, though, when you bring out the car, they take that car, and then they go over into the corner, and they start, zooming the car, and then they're not paying attention to you at all. The toy pulls their attention and makes assessment of AAC really difficult. So in those cases, I move to the second section right here, which says easier attention shift with AAC. I'll take all the toys, I'll put them in the closet, and then I'll try to get the child's engagement using activities such as singing, dancing, tickling, squeezing, spinning in my chair, or swinging in a blanket. Now, if I'm tickling the child and they think it's funny and then they look up at me, now I've got their attention where the toy itself was interfering with that attention. So now that I've got their attention and they're liking the tickling, they're motivated, now I'm going to bring in my tickle picture to see if they can move their attention between me and the tickle picture. And then finally, toys and activities that I use as a last resort or only when necessary. I try really hard to stay away from using food and electronic materials because those are the most motivating for a lot of kids. I think some therapists start there. Hey, it's so motivating. I know it's motivating. I'm going to start with my food and my toys, my food and my electronic toys. And I feel like sometimes you're into a trap where the child will use a picture for a food, but then everything else pales by comparison. So I never start there. I always start with a toy and then remove the toy and then end up with food or electronics. So what we're really looking at here is the cognitive demand under these varying conditions, right? Communication using any modality requires a variety of cognitive processing skills, including different kinds of attention and memory. The child has to receive and process the incoming message and then formulate and transmit a response. With aided AAC, or using a picture or a device, there is an added element of visual processing that increases the cognitive demand. So with any of these assessment processes, and that's what you're playing around with. You're playing around with how much can I push, and oops, I've lost the child. Now I have to back up and make the task easier. Okay. So here's some examples of Velcro picture symbols. We have two books in the toolkit. One is photographs and one is line drawings. And then we have concrete symbols, ball, book, bubbles, beads, and abstract symbols, go, tickle, swing. How I use these materials, again, is to pull out one or two pictures and make sure to probe for their attention. If I have my ball in my car and I've got the attention on the car, well, I might take all of that away and pull out the picture of the ball in the car to make sure that I still have my attention, because now I've got this two-dimensional symbol. For some kids who use the picture exchange communication system, or PECS, I will have my Velcro picture and I will probe for phase 1 of the picture exchange system. Those are typically for the communicators who have very low initiation and no symbol use, and you can refer to the literature on the picture exchange communication system for more information on that. I also use Velcro pictures when there's some motor involvement. Maybe there's some spasticity where they can't get their finger, their arm or their finger to point. So I can spread out my picture symbols and I can watch them make a choice. And if they can't use their hand, then I can hold up the 2 pictures and I can look at their eyes and watch what they do with their eyes and how they shift their gaze for eye gaze. In the AAC toolkit, we have a diagnostic picture symbol book that varies by symbol type and number of symbols. The book starts with one end of photographs in a field of 3, 4, 6, 12, 24, and 48. And the other side of the book, it flips, and then there's just the line drawings, the board maker symbols, again in 3, 4, 6, smaller to 12 to 24 to 48. And I can quickly go through this book to get a sense of where the cognitive load is too much for a child. So they've picked the car, I've got their attention, I've got their motivation, and now I'm going to start to introduce symbols just to see if they can find the car picture in a field of 3. Can they find it in 6? Can they find it in 12? Can they find it in 24? Now if they've got that, I might try to get them to look for the go picture, which is right here. Because the go picture, a green arrow, is cognitively more complex, right? So I'm increasing the cognitive demand. Were they able to do it? Maybe they were able to find the car picture in the field of 48, but they won't find the go picture. Oop, I'm gonna back up. I'm gonna go back to here to see if I can get my go to know that they understand that symbol. Here's some examples of picture symbol boards and books. We have this book and this book, the first 2 on the top line, available to hand out to families. We try to keep those in stock in the clinic so that the child can walk out with something to work on at home. For some kids, having a book with pictures is way too much fun just to flip the pages of the book. And the book can seem too confusing or too overwhelming for the families, but yet I still want to introduce picture symbol communication into the home. So we have a variety of picture symbol boards that we can give to families that we keep in stock. And I'll describe these to families as, you know, your child, maybe we'll use this field of 8 here, if you can see my cursor, where there's a picture of sleep and a picture of tickle and a picture of good night. And you're going to put that in your child's bedroom and you're going to start to model what it is to use pictures and talk at the same time. For all of these materials, we are observing their sustained attention, how they shift attention, and their ability to coordinate how they're looking and pointing at the same time. We are also observing that under different language conditions. So just to make a request, like I want car, or to comment, wow, fast, or then to combine words. Then I'll take out my tablet. There are over 200 communication applications that exist, and most of them are horrible. But there are a good chunk of them that are strong, robust language systems. And I'm thinking that we should have a tablet in the AAC toolkit, although it would need to be charged. There are 4 or 5 apps that I have on my assessment tablets that could be pulled out and probed with a child. But what I want to say here is that sometimes you'll get a family who has a tablet and they bring it in and they say, hey, we're trying this app. There are some apps that I don't like, in particular, these two on the left-hand side. I don't like this green one here because it has these arrows at the bottom that can be really distracting to young kids who just like to go pokey poke. I'm not a big fan of this one either, although it's super cute and it's a good starting point. Families like it, but it doesn't really build language. This one here in the middle top is called Sounding Board, and it is my go-to, very simple, free app that I will recommend to families if they're just starting out with picture symbol communication. And then finally, there's a variety of robust language apps. The one on the bottom middle is called the Grid, and the two on the right-hand side is Touch Chat Word Power. The reason I put these up is just to show that what we're really looking for with our context-dependent communicators is to give them a robust language system so that they can really grow their language. A paper-based system, if you're flipping pages, is going to be too slow. For those emergent symbolic communicators, I might recommend the sounding board, the simple one, but when I'm starting to pull out the tablet, I'm noticing that it's the backlit screen and the voice of the tablet that allows the child to really pay attention. So sometimes for the pre-symbolic intentional communicators, or for those emergent symbolic communicators, sometimes it's just the presence of the backlit screen and the voice that really allows them to use the pictures versus the low tech. Here's a slide on low tech. And just to say, you could use a jelly bean or a buddy button with a switch toy to look at cause and effect. For the pre-symbolic, pre-intentional, or pre-symbolic intentional communicators, you might choose to use the step-by-steps or the voice output communicators to look at something like reciprocity or their awareness of using voice output as a communicative tool. And then finally, we have some old school, I call them old school, static display devices, and these are still really useful for some kids. Here's a list of our AAC assessment materials. I use these from time to time, depending on the student, the child who comes in. And they're here for your reference. And certainly you can reach out to me if you're interested in learning more about these. Okay, we're going to get into a child's capabilities. We look at motor, we look at vision, hearing, cognition, attention. We're looking at their language, their linguistic factors, if there's literacy or emergent literacy, what's happening with their speech, how they're relating socially, and what kind of behaviors they're bringing to the table. I was asked, I did this talk a couple weeks ago, and I was asked to show a slide that shows the difference for vision. But what I tried to do here is just give you an idea of what you might do when you encounter a little struggle. So for motor, I always start with a 2 by 2 inch picture, and I try to go down to a 1 by 1 inch. But if they don't have a point, if they're just using a whole hand, I might bump up to a 3 by 3 inch picture. If I'm not sure if they can see it, for acuity, I'll go from a 2 by 2 inch to a 1 by 1 inch. But then if there's maybe the presence of a cortical vision impairment, or it just doesn't seem like they're seeing the images, and you're not sure if it's vision or if it's cognition, right? So then I might play around with this image, which is a high contrast. Looking below at the word go, same principles. The green arrow meaning go is very abstract. I could make that cognitively less complex by using a stroller picture to say, hey, we're going to go outside. Or I might make it bigger, like a green light, if kids know what that is, or a door, meaning we're going to go out the door. So there's a way to play with the visual materials in order to get at what are they doing with their motor, what are they understanding with their vision, how they're looking at all the pictures, and then what do they understand cognitively about the complexity of those pictures. Okay, so you're thinking about that whole child and the child's capabilities, and here's my analogy for that. Everything that we've talked about so far is diagnostic. The materials that you're using are not the recommendations. You've got your child, you've got your materials, you are at mission control. You're gathering your data about how the child interacts with those materials, right? So you're thinking to yourself, yeah, I think pictures could be useful. They're pretty good. They can handle a pretty big field of pictures. It really helps their vocabulary. And now you're getting close to that dreaded feature matching, right? And you're going, uh-oh. You still have to survey the moon before you land. And so the analogy is surveying the moon is your feature matching. I have to figure out what's out there in order to match it to my child's capabilities, and then whew, we can land on the moon. So this is what you're doing. You're looking at the child's current communication ability. You're looking at what they did with AAC, and then you're thinking about the different features. How did they access it? Oh, with their finger. What was the array size? They did really well with 24, but not 48. How was it laid out based on their age and their diagnosis and what they need? I may have laid it out contextually, like a bubbles picture, a bubbles board, or I may have laid it out core fringe vocabulary. What kind of symbol set did they use? Was it more photographs or line drawings? Does it need to be portable? Should I be looking at low tech versus high tech, and so forth? So we all talk about environmental opportunity considerations, what influences progress, and I just wanted to point some of these out. We all know to think about the health of the child, their sleep patterns, their nutrition, any trauma. We all think about the parent's culture, beliefs, attitudes, and expectations as it relates to using AAC. I often think about what's going on in that home setting. How likely is it that this is going to get carried over? Are there siblings that make home life maybe a little more chaotic? What is the technology ability of the family? And I use this term really broadly. Do they have transportation to get to and from the therapy appointments? Can they drive to Office Max to go print something out on a color printer, or do they have one at home? Do they have internet access? Do they have a smartphone versus a landline phone? And so these are questions that I'll ask families so that I understand what they need for support. Maybe they have a phone, and then that sounding board free app is going to be the best place for them to land. Another barrier is things like policies. One example of this would be if a child is using a communication system at school, but the school says that it can't go home. So that can interfere with the parent's ability to do what the school is doing. And then finally, I put money on there. And I put money on there because I don't know, I think that it is just something that we need to talk about. We need to be aware of. There are families who will just go out and buy an iPad, and they'll put it on credit if they need to, and they just do it. But there are some families who really can't do that. And so being mindful and being thoughtful about saying, well, you should just go practice on an iPad, and versus thinking about how to support that family without making them feel bad or feel pressured to go out and buy technology. Okay. So how to prepare parents for when you're starting to talk about AAC? We always want to define AAC for parents. We all use different ways to communicate. We talk, we gesture, we text. We want to tell families that AAC doesn't prevent speech, and in fact, AAC can really nurture and support speech and language development. We want to ensure families that we will provide the training so that they'll learn how to use the AAC materials. I truly believe that AAC in the home is the tipping point for communication growth, more so than just using AAC systems at therapy or at school. So as a therapist, if I figured out a way that something works with an AAC system, the next thing I'm going to do is figure out a way to get it into the home. We want to remind families that AAC is multimodality. We are always encouraging multiple forms of communication, that we're never stopping trying speech or a little bit of sign language or the picture symbols. We're doing all of it. And then I come back to, again, we're always talking about a plan of care. We're going to try this out for 3 months in short-term therapy, and then we're going to revisit, we're going to talk about it. Did it work? Did it not work? So to summarize the key ideas, we're looking at the child's diagnosis, their prognosis for speech development, what is their developmental trajectory with speech and language acquisition. I also look at other developmental milestones when I'm thinking about making decisions. I look at their history of eating and oral motor. I look at, are they toilet trained? I look at their concept development for those younger kids. Do they know their colors and shapes? Do they have joint attention? Can they do a yes or no? To me, that's a good milestone. And then another one that it might be more unfamiliar to SLPs is a distal point. So being able to point to something further away relates to the idea of learning to use symbols. So I look at those other developmental milestones. So we're using dynamic assessment to probe for AAC use and stimulability activities to see if this AAC is making a difference. We're looking at the rate of improvement as it's compared to maybe using other instructional methods. And then we're also taking into consideration the cognitive demands. So is AAC a good idea? Well, try it. Does it result in faster acquisition of speech, language, and communication skills than using more traditional instructional approaches? You reassess at 3 months and then refer for an AAC evaluation if you need more precise insight. And that's my references. Thank you for listening.